Let's bring in our panel. In Beirut is Benjamin Walsby, who co-authored Amnesty International's report on Raqqa. Here in the studio is retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, who was the U.S. military's spokesman in Iraq. And also with me in the studio is Ammar Kahf, an executive director at the Omran Center for Strategic Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you for joining us here on The Newsmakers. General Kimmitt, let's start with you. You are a person that has previous experience in assessing civilian casualties. It's been 8 months since the coalition defeated Daesh in Raqqa, liberating its the city and recapturing it from its de facto capital. And this report by Amnesty International says that the incidents, namely the deaths of hundreds of innocent civilians as a result of the coalition airstrikes, has not been investigated by the U.S. It's been 8 months. Why hasn't the U.S. Attempted to start an investigation?
Well, that's just categorically not correct. If you go onto the website of the coalition, it will show you that those incidents being investigated and it's being fully transparent. So I believe that short of on-the-ground investigations, which for obvious reasons can't be done in Raqqa right now, that the coalition is doing exactly what it should.
Benjamin Walsby, before publishing this report, did you approach the Pentagon for a comment or an interview or to get the latest stats into this report?
We did, yeah. We wrote to the three countries that carried out the bombing, so the US, the UK and France. The US requested more time. We felt we'd given them quite enough time, considering we gave them the coordinates of the incidents that we wanted them to look into. They should have this information, but they wanted more time, so we went ahead and published anyway. But if I could address the point that the Brigadier General made about the on-site investigations, I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't do this. I don't see any obvious reasons why that can't happen. We went and we did it. Their partner forces, the SDF, are in full control of the city, so therefore there's no reason why a team of US investigators wouldn't be able to go to the city and investigate on the ground, because when you go to the ground, you realize it's a very different thing from watching the video feeds, which is how they do their investigations. I mean, so far the coalition admits to having killed 23 civilians in Raqqa. In one of our cases, they killed more members of a family than that. I mean, they're so wide of the mark, and it's because they're not investigating properly. And you can go onto their website and you can see that most of the reports of civilian casualties are just listed as non-credible, and then they're not investigated.
General?
Well, first of all, let's put this in perspective. I start off at a very back-footed position because let's acknowledge war is not a good thing. Nobody wants to resort to it. But I find it interesting that the number 23 was brought up. And every one of those casualties is a tragedy. But Great Britain used to kill upwards of 20,000 to 30,000 civilians in a single bomb strike in World War II at Hamburg and at Dresden. And I think, again, 23 is too large of a number. 0 is the right number. But I think those numbers demonstrate the incredible pains that we go to avoid civilian casualties. Nothing is mentioned about the number of targets that were waved off because of the danger of civilian casualties. I did this for a living inside the United States military. I just left Baghdad this morning. I know what incredible pains they went to avoid these civilian casualties.
But there is a difference, you must admit, in terms of the technology between World War I and right now. For the last 15 years, the U.S. Army has been saying that we're using precision munitions, smart bombs, and this is something that you've defended for the better part of more than a decade. But when you look at the numbers that Amnesty report is actually putting forth, would it be a little bit too presumptuous to actually say that maybe it's not as precise as the bombs may be called?
Well, let's be very clear. Anytime you kill a civilian, that's one too many. But again, when you go from Bomber Harris, one of the great heroes of the British military, killing 20,000 civilians in one day, versus the fact that over a period of time, we have been able to reduce that to an infinitesimal decimal of that number, I think it goes to show the tremendous pains. We'll never be happy until the number is 0, but that's not reality. The reality of war is when you have an enemy that wraps themselves around civilians intentionally to use them as human shields, the vast majority of the times we don't attack because we know that there are some times when the estimates are wrong, and tragedies like the 23 members of that family are killed.
We'll continue with the reality of war, but I want to bring in Ammar Kahf. When you look at how this operation was planned, was it a well-planned operation?
Well, I don't see indicators of a well-planned operation, to be honest. I see an operation that relied heavily on intel based on a group that is very controversial on the ground, a group that has missed and gave coordinates of a school, for example, to the U.S. Army that shelled it in the west of Raqqa. So I believe that it could have been done much better, with much more coordination with actors on the ground. There were way too many strikes. Every square kilometers of Raqqa received at least 800 strikes on average per month for the 5-month period. And so it was very heavily shelled without a plan to save or to send or to safeguard the civilians. And at the end, there was a plan to give an exit pathway for the leftover ISIS fighters to exit the city safely. So I think there was, obviously there were many plans being put, but I think the plan was not good enough. And the precision bombers that the US used in other places were much more precise in targeting specific targets, meaning specifically targeting leadership. I did not see the indicators on the ground that relied, and the level of destruction is huge. After 8 months now of the operation, we still, not more than 50%, from my figures at least on the ground, have returned to those cities. Their cities are still not safe to return. The mines have not been swept. Huge civilian and infrastructure damages. And still the governing council of Raqqa is still a very controversial one. And this has actually led to the incitement of pro-Iran and pro-regime forces to call for the resistance movement in Raqqa to target again American soldiers. And so this, I think it's counterproductive, and it has already led now to the Baqir groups in Raqqa trying to capitalize on these numbers of casualties and say, hey, listen, the Americans did not do a good job and we should fight back. And that's very unfortunate. That's something that was not accounted for. That's when you focus on fighting ISIS and ignoring the context and ignoring the partners that are being used on the ground that could backfire on everybody, to be honest.
General Kimmitt, Ammar said this was not a well-planned operation. The intelligence gathering process was flawed at times. Let me add another ring into this. The Defense Secretary, James Mattis, said before this operation that this was going to be a war of annihilation. When all this is said, doesn't it give the impression that in war all is fair? And I want you to compare that to what you said, even one civilian death is too many for you.
Well, let me unpack a couple of the comments you made. If, in fact, Raqqa was singled out for particular destruction, as was suggested, I would recommend my colleague go up to Mosul and see the amount of damage that was done in Mosul. What I would also expect somebody to acknowledge is right now we have hundreds of demining operations going on in Fallujah and in Mosul, and eventually they will have to get to Raqqa as well. As to the planning, again, when I was a commander, I used to direct strikes. When I was a planner, I used to conduct planning. I can tell you, I spend a lot of time near the forces inside of Baghdad. They have been planning the liberation of Raqqa for years, if not, certainly large numbers of months, if not years. And to suggest that it was not properly planned, I think, is a comment that it comes from no factual basis. We spent hours and hours and hours, days and weeks planning the attack on Raqqa, and I think it's important to recognize that Raqqa is no longer the caliphate for the Islamic State, which has been such a brutal force throughout the world.
Benjamin, the general has said right now that they go through a very rigorous process. The U.S.-led coalition has stated on many instances that they apply those rigorous standards when they are planning an operation like this or the targeting process, and they take extraordinary efforts to protect non-combatants. Is this what you saw?
I'm afraid the gap between the narrative coming from the coalition and the reality on the ground in Raqqa is staggering. If the Brigadier General went to Raqqa, as we did, I also worked in Mosul, I also co-authored our report on Mosul, but if he went, or if his investigators, US military investigators, coalition investigators went to the ground in Raqqa, they would learn something about the brutal realities of war, something they like to talk about as if they have a monopoly on understanding that, when they don't actually go. We should also be a bit more honest about the numbers, frankly. The coalition has admitted to 23 civilian deaths. I see no point in making comparisons with whatever the British Army did in the Second World War. That was awful. I'm not going to defend that for a second. But hopefully, as people, we advance and we move on. There's also a very different legal framework in place now than there was at that time too. But 23 are not the right numbers. I mean, we had 39 from one family. In four cases, just 4 cases we focused on. The coalition's responsible for killing 70. That's 4 cases. There's strikes on every street in Raqqa. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to work out the numbers. And we're being conservative, frankly, when we put in the report hundreds of civilians, because it's more likely to be thousands. In terms of the planning, yes, they did have time. Of course they have time, and they took time. And they should have known, because ISIS was the same enemy. They were using the same tactics in Mosul that they used in Raqqa. But here's a question for the Brigadier General. What about the size of the bombs? There's 2 problems, essentially, with the targeting. If you don't know what you're shooting at, you're going to shoot at the wrong thing. Video drones will not show you the families cowering in the back rooms and the basements. And yes, they hide there for a long time. So watching it for an hour and a half is probably not going to be long enough to establish their patterns of life, but that's something the coalition could and should have known. Secondly, why use such big bombs? I mean, you've got smaller munitions available which can hit precise targets. There's no point in precision targeting. If the bomb you drop is so big, it's going to kill your target, but it's going to kill everybody else around them as well. And time after time, we've witnessed buildings that suffered airstrikes and being destroyed completely. That means the bombs they were using were too big.
General, was it poor surveillance, and why so big bombs?
Well, first of all, let's be very clear. That was not the only intelligence that we're using. Video surveillance, we're using signals intelligence, we're using human intelligence, we're using other types of intelligence. Obviously, we can't discuss that here. Anybody who goes to a battlefield after a battle certainly understands the tragedy that happened there. Somebody who's actually been in the battle and has seen the horrific aspects of what ISIS does to individual civilians. Would we have had a better solution? If we did, we would have used it. Everybody criticizes how we did it. Everybody criticizes the fact that we did not keep the civilian casualties down to 0. Yet I hear no constructive solutions about how it would have been done better by those civilians sitting on the sidelines as we're putting our troops into the breach.
But what do you say to the mother of that family, what was written in Benjamin and in the Amnesty International report, where they said that the planes had circled and asked if the U.S. planes, if they couldn't identify them as civilians?
Well, again, these are all allegations. And to suggest that the United States and its coalition partners don't do investigations, the fact that they are not complete yet doesn't mean that they are not ever going to be investigated. We saw time and time again allegations of bombings, allegations of targets being hit that proved not to be true. But look, I appreciate everything that Amnesty International is trying to do. I appreciate the fact that they help us understand the tragedy, that this is not some video game, that this actually has consequences on the ground. We would prefer to have a better way. Amnesty International has not suggested a better way. My colleague has not suggested a better way. I don't like putting American soldiers and talking to their mothers about why their sons and daughters died as well. And to suggest that I don't understand war, coming from an academic, I think is, well, I won't get into the ad hominem discussions here.
Benjamin, the general said that he'd like to see a better way. What could that way be?
Well, first, I appreciate the General's comments about Amnesty. He does seem to accept that we have a role to play in this, and that's constructive, that's good. A better way, well, investigating properly would be a good start, a very good start. Another thing that we're suggesting is that the coalition releases information, more information about its strikes, because if it's true that they abided by international humanitarian law, the laws of war, 100% in every single strike, they would have nothing to fear by releasing, not at the time, nobody's asking for a running commentary, that's silly. But afterwards, and even some weeks afterwards, within a reasonable time frame, they could tell us a bit more about the locations of strikes, the explosive weights used, and the targets, and yet they don't. They report on their strikes and they say near Raqqa. Why the deliberate vagueness? Well, I mean, if they abided by the law all the time, then what have they got to hide? So these are things that they could do to improve things. They could release the information, which would allow us to have a better idea about, because we don't say that they violated international law because we don't have enough information. Only they can provide that information. What we say is that there's a strong prima facie case to answer, which there is, but it's having access to that kind of information that would allow people to be more definite about legalities and issues concerned. And I think everybody agrees that that is important. So yeah, more transparency and serious investigations with on-site visits. The Brigadier General didn't answer my question about why US forces couldn't go to Raqqa when their partner forces are in complete control of the city, because they could.
Well, again, what I've heard is a constructive narrative on how to investigate incidents. What I have not heard is a constructive narrative on how we can avoid this in the first place if we don't use precision weapons
Sure.
and we don't use these types of military strikes. Are we going to drop unicorns and baby dolls against ISIS and expect them to give up? That's ludicrous. War is always the last resort. War is always the last resort. We prefer not to do it, but sometimes you have to put your young men and women into the breach to stop evil like ISIS.
Ammar, you've heard Benjamin, and you've actually heard the General speak, but when you look at this report and the discussion that's been going on, do you feel that, does this reflect a different reality here, what's being sort of said in Raqqa?
I mean, the people's lives were destroyed by ISIS first, and first actually by the Assad regime that has also tortured the people of Raqqa, and then by ISIS. And no one is contesting that ISIS has committed humongous crimes against the people, and this was the headquarters of ISIS, and it was important to perhaps annihilate ISIS headquarters. But what's being questioned is the precision levels of the weapons that have been used. I believe that the precision was not a very high precision weaponry, because the results look like it was not high precision, and that there could have been better ones. Now, the life on the ground today has been very controversial. Again, the Raqqa local council has been a very controversial one, causing a lot of backlash.
General Mark Kimitz, Ammar Kahf, and Benjamin Wolseley from Beirut, thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers.
Sure.